A phantom dish leads to danger. Welcome to Poirot Files. I am your host, Dexter. Our bond grows stronger. Share where you're joining from. Hearing from you is the best. Let's investigate. It started with a Tuesday afternoon and a knock on the door that didn't sound like it belonged. It was too polite for a delivery man and too nervous for someone who belonged in our little temple of order and orchid cultivation. I was at my desk, wrestling with the latest stack of bills that Wolfe, in his usual generosity, pretended didn't exist. Fritz was clanking around in the kitchen, preparing something that probably had a name Wolfe couldn't pronounce, but would eat in silence with a glass of beer held at a precise angle. When I opened the door, the woman standing there looked like she was lost, but determined not to admit it. She wore a camel-colored coat, stylish but a few seasons behind, and clutched a notebook like it was a shield. Her hair was pinned too tightly. Her eyes moved like they didn't trust her surroundings. "Or me, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer but needed the question to buy herself time. I gave her the professional smile. "You've got the right man. And the wrong day if you're selling anything." "I'm not," she said quickly. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It's about a dish." That caught me. "You mean food?" "Yes. A recipe. A meal, to be exact. One that doesn't exist." She didn't blink, and for a second I wondered if Wolfe had finally summoned a hallucination. I let her in because if someone says they've lost a recipe and they're desperate enough to bother Nero Wolfe about it, you don't send them away. You feed them to the lion. She followed me into the front room with the quiet of someone who'd just walked into church and didn't know the hymn. Wolfe was, predictably, in his chair. He had his lips slightly pursed and his eyes half closed, which meant he was trying not to acknowledge a disruption. I cleared my throat. "This is Miss Daria Helms," she offered, barely audible. "I'm a food writer." Wolfe didn't move, didn't open his eyes. "Mr. Goodwin, take her to the dining room and return when she is ready to speak." "In complete sentences," I blinked. Daria turned crimson. "No," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I'm not here to sell a book. I'm not here for a favor. I'm here because a chef in the village tried to murder his career with a dish that I never wrote. And someone is trying to convince the world that I did." Now Wolfe opened his eyes. "Explain," he said, and waved her toward the red chair. That meant business. She sat with that same taut poise, like she was balancing a tray in a storm. "I write a food column. I've been doing it for 12 years. Last week, a restaurant called Tamarind and Iron, new, expensive, ambitious, announced they'd be serving le velouté de cendre. That's French for ash soup, according to their opening. Night right up. It was based on an unpublished recipe of mine. The chef swore he got it directly from me." "And?" Wolfe prompted, eyes now fully open. "I never wrote that recipe. I've never heard of it. But the write-up included phrases." "I did write descriptions from an old piece of mine, word for word. I've been plagiarized, sure, it happens. But this was personal. Someone took something I never created and made it mine." Wolfe leaned back an inch. For him, that was akin to leaping out of his chair. "That is nonsense," he said flatly. "No one can steal something that doesn't exist." "I agree," Daria said. "But someone did. The recipe exists now, and it's poisoning my reputation. If I sue, they'll say it was mine. If I deny it, they'll say I'm hiding. I need proof. I need to know who made this thing up, who planted it, and why they'd go through so much trouble to make it look like I did it." Wolfe closed his eyes again, this time with a sigh that had the weight of a turkey dinner. "You've come to me because this is a matter of precision, authenticity, and theft," she added, Intellectual theft. Sabotage, maybe. Someone's trying to ruin me. There was silence. Then Wolfe said, "Have you eaten?" She looked confused. "No," he rang for Fritz. "I will consider your case," Wolfe said, "but I will not do so on an empty stomach. Mr. Goodwin, we will dine. Then you will accompany Miss Helms to the restaurant. Take notes. Eat nothing." Daria looked relieved. I looked mildly offended, and "If they serve you the dish that didn't exist," Wolfe muttered, "bring me a sample, carefully." And just like that it began. A woman with no enemies had shown up with a meal no one could prove existed, except that it had already been served. Wolfe's instructions were clear enough. Don't eat, don't argue, and don't let the food distract me. That last part might sound easy to a civilian, but for someone who's sampled Fritz's scallop quenelles and lived to tell the tale, walking into a high-end kitchen and pretending to be immune takes a bit of acting. Still, professionalism called, and I answered. We headed downtown that evening, Daria sitting beside me in the cab with the stiffness of someone preparing for trial. I glanced at her twice, once to gauge her nerves and again to see if she was about to bolt. "You sure you want to go back in there?" I asked. "I've seen boxers with more relaxed shoulders. I need to see if they're still serving it," she said. "And if he's still saying it came from me." We pulled up to Tamarind and Iron, a slick, modernist cube of glass and brushed metal shoved between a dry cleaner and an overpriced hat shop. The place was barely a week old and already had the smug glow of premature success. Inside, the walls were bare concrete, the lighting was theatrical, and the waiters looked like they'd rather be models. We were seated with the usual ceremony, but the maitre d' flinched when Daria gave her name. I noticed the way his lips tightened, not enough to qualify for an apology, but enough to mark a problem. A few minutes later, a man in his 30s glided over to our table. Thin, sharp-nosed, with hands that fluttered instead of rested, he introduced himself as Chef Adrian Galt. "Miss Helms," he said, with a smile that was so polished it slid off his face. "I'm surprised you're here after everything." "After what?" she asked evenly. "Well, the reviews have been mixed. I can't imagine you're thrilled with how they interpreted your work. It must be painful to see it so diluted." "I've already told you," she said, steel edging into her tone. "That dish is not mine. You stole lines from one of my old articles and forged a recipe." He gave a low chuckle, the kind you use when someone's embarrassing themselves in public. "Miss Helms, we've already discussed this. You emailed it to me. I have the printout. I thought it was odd you didn't want credit, but—" "Liar," she snapped. I was watching closely, and if the chef was acting, he deserved an award. His eyebrows lifted just enough to look hurt, not offended. He gestured to a waiter, and within minutes a plate was brought over with the infamous soup, velouté de cendre. I'd expected something dramatic, jet black maybe, or smoky and strange, but it looked like an ordinary creamy broth, faintly grey, with tiny shavings of truffle and a scatter of something that resembled charcoal dust. It didn't look like poison, but it didn't look inviting either. "This," said Galt, "is the version we debuted. It was supposed to be the highlight of the menu. You should be proud." Daria didn't answer. She just stared at it like it had spoken to her in tongues. I took out my notepad and scribbled details: aroma, consistency, garnishing. I didn't touch it, but I leaned close. "Fritz once told me real truffle has a whisper, not a shout." This was shouting. "You have a copy of the recipe she sent?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Back office," he said, glancing toward the kitchen. "I can get it. Please do." While he was gone, I looked at Daria. She hadn't touched the soup either. Her hands were folded tight on her lap, the corners of her mouth pulled in. "He's bluffing," she said. Maybe, I replied. But even a bluff has to be built on something. Let's see what he brings back. When Galt returned, he handed over a printed email with a few attached pages, supposedly the recipe. The email address looked like hers, but something was off. It wasn't just the phrasing, it was the way it was formatted. She frowned, then pulled out her phone and typed something rapidly. Someone made a fake account using my name, she muttered. I'll prove it. I folded the recipe and stuck it in my coat pocket. Mind if I take this to verify? Galt shrugged. As you wish, but it won't help. The dish is real, the credit is yours whether you like it or not. We left the restaurant without eating. Back in the cab, I called Wolfe. I have the soup, I told him. Well, a sample, in a sealed-to-go container, untouched, and a printout of the email he claims came from Daria. Good, Wolfe said. Do not allow Fritz to refrigerate it yet. I wish to see it. And the email. When we returned, Daria followed me in. Wolfe was in his office, naturally. I placed the items on the desk. He sniffed the container once, scowled, and didn't open it. You are certain this is the dish as presented? Verbatim, I said. Down to the smug delivery, he waved. Me off, Miss Helms. You are aware that forgery in email is child's play. The real question is not whether the recipe is yours, it is who would benefit from making it appear so. She hesitated. I don't know. I've written about restaurants for years, critiqued them. Some owners didn't like what I said. But this is something else. You mentioned no enemies, Wolfe said. No personal ones. But my last column did touch a nerve. I criticized a pop-up in Williamsburg, called it a recycling bin of clichés dressed in foam and reduction. The chef was furious. A man named Tobias Crane. He wrote a letter to my editor threatening to sue, then vanished. Wolfe's eyes opened a notch. And the style of this dish? Pretentious, obscure. Designed for attention, exactly his. He sat back. Mr. Goodwin, you will find this Tobias Crane. I will speak to Saul. There is something unsavory here, not merely the soup. Daria looked at Wolfe with something like hope. Mr. Wolfe, she said, voice steadier. Do you believe me? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, I believe something has been created to ruin you. Whether it is cuisine or conspiracy remains to be seen, but it will not be tolerated in my house. Archie Goodwin, reporter without portfolio, was back on the street, and I had a name to find, a mystery to chase, and a deadline Wolfe wouldn't admit he cared about, finding Tobias. Crane wasn't going to be as easy as looking up a number and ringing a bell. Chefs, especially the vengeful kind, don't leave forwarding addresses after a scathing review guts their latest venture. But if there's one thing I've learned under Wolfe's commandment of precision, it's this. A man's ego leaves footprints. I started with the editor of Food Weekly, who gave me nothing but a chuckle and a good luck. But 20 minutes and 3 phone calls later, I had a partial address, a disgruntled ex-sous chef, and a rumor that Tobias was licking his wounds in a warehouse kitchen on the Lower East Side, consulting on a series of experimental menus that hadn't seen daylight. The kitchen turned out to be real, low ceilings, exposed brick, too many knives in reach. When I walked in, I saw a line of younger cooks fussing over sauces with the intensity of bomb diffusers. Tobias himself was off to the side, cigarette dangling from his lip, sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching a saucepan like it had insulted his mother. He was wiry, pale, and had the kind of face you didn't forget, sharp cheekbones, a mouth always poised to say something cruel. He didn't recognize me, of course, so I introduced myself as a food writer working on a piece about reclusive chefs and their secret recipes. He laughed once, dry and sour, and offered me a stool near a prep station that smelled like old anchovies. "You're late," he said, as if we had an appointment. "They only remember you when you're gone." "You went quiet fast," I said. "What happened to your pop-up?" "Helms happened." He stabbed out the cigarette on a metal tray. "She came in, tore it apart, and that was it. 2 investors pulled out by morning. Review dropped Friday night. I was out by Monday. Must have stung." He gave me a look that would curdle milk. "She called my work a desperate cry for relevance dressed in edible glue." "You ever had your passion reduced to a punchline?" "Daily," I said. "But not in print?" I watched his hands. Burn scars told stories his mouth didn't. The man had worked kitchens for decades, but something about him said he'd never gotten comfortable in them. "What do you think of tamarind and iron?" I asked casually. He scoffed. "Pretentious garbage. Copycats with credit cards." "They're serving a new dish," I said. "Ash soup, said to be based on Helms's writing." That got him. His lips parted just a little, and something flickered behind his eyes. "Cendres?" he asked. "I invented that." He said it like someone finally recognized his child. "Really?" 2 years ago, for a private tasting in Tribeca. It was never on a menu, just an idea. She was there. "She who?" "Helms. Daria Helms. She was invited by a friend. Said she wasn't writing about it. Took notes anyway." "That's not the story she tells." He leaned forward, voice dropping. "That dish was mine. I built it from charcoal-roasted leeks, white asparagus, and a truffle foam reduction. She saw it, took the idea, warped it. Now they're selling it as hers." "Why didn't you go public?" He gave a humorless grin. "'Cause I'd be the bitter chef whining that a critic stole his thunder. No one cares, but it was mine." I thanked him, left a phony card, and walked out into the street with my head buzzing. Wolfe wasn't going to like this. It meant we had 2 claims on a dish no one wanted to eat, one of them attached to a man with a grudge and a motive. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I recounted everything. He didn't move except to sip beer and raise one eyebrow every time I mentioned stolen credit, creative theft, or culinary betrayal. 2 creators, he said. 1 dish. Each accuses the other, and the restaurant serves it as hers while she denies authorship. Curious? Crane has motive, I said. He got crushed by her review. If he forged an email from her, slipped it to Adrian Galt, and framed her, he'd get revenge and exposure. All without lifting a knife. True, Wolfe said. But he claims she stole it first, so it is either vengeance or justice, depending on whom one believes. He swiveled slightly in his chair, which meant his mind was shifting gears. Any mention of the third party? What third party? He tapped a finger on the armrest. Galt, the chef. He claims to have received the recipe from Helms, but if neither of them sent it, who did? I froze. You think Galt's being manipulated? Possibly. Or he is the manipulator. Either way, the intermediary bears scrutiny. That led us to our next stop, the editor of Epitable, an online culinary magazine that had recently run a glowing review of tamarind and iron. The review quoted Daria directly, lines from her old pieces strung into praise for a dish she supposedly birthed. The editor, one Vernon Trace, welcomed me with too much enthusiasm and a half-buttoned floral shirt. His office smelled like citrus body spray and ego. "Big fan of your work," he said. "You freelancing again?" "I'm investigating something," I said. "That review you ran, who supplied the quotes?" "Came from Galt's press kit," he said. "Said it was adapted with permission. We cross-checked, matched up with Daria's old columns. We assumed it was authorized." "Did you speak to Daria directly?" "No, but I emailed the address listed in the kit. Got a confirmation reply. Seemed official. He showed me the email chain. Same forged address, same vague language. No details, no signature, just a curt, permission granted, proceed. I took screenshots and left. Back at the brownstone, I laid everything on Wolfe's desk. He stared at the screen for a full minute. Mr. Goodwin, we now have the recipe, the forgery, the editor who ran it, the chef who served it, and 2 individuals who claim to have created it. Yet none of them admit to sending that email. One is lying. Or all of them are, I said. Wolfe let out a breath, slow and tight. Bring me Saul and Theodore. And call Lon Cohen. I want every connection between these individuals, especially financial. Someone profited from this fiction. I intend to find out who. Daria, still seated quietly across the room, spoke for the first time in an hour. I don't care about credit, she said. I care about my name, my work, my integrity. Wolfe looked at her, and for a brief moment his gaze softened. And someone has stirred the ashes of all 3, he said. Mr. Goodwin, the game begins. Let us find the liar who served a dish that didn't exist and made us all taste it. Wolfe doesn't like leaving the brownstone. He doesn't like walking, waiting, or weather. He especially doesn't like asking. That's where I come in. I knock, snoop, flirt, follow, and occasionally lie, all in the service of justice and Wolfe's oversized appetite for truth. The good news? Most people never see me coming. The bad news? When they do, it's usually because they've got something to hide. First stop, Adrian Galt. Again. I dropped by Tamarind and Iron without calling ahead, which isn't polite, but manners don't dig up motives. The restaurant was quiet in the late afternoon lull, and I caught Adrian near the wine fridge, arguing with a supplier over the phone. He saw me and hung up with a glare sharp enough to cut fillet. You again? He muttered. Still me, I replied. You said you got the recipe from Daria Helms, but you also said she emailed it and now we know the address was a fake. So, unless you want this whole thing blown into the next edition of Epitable, correction section included, you might want to stop pretending and start explaining. He swallowed. His knuckles tightened on the wine bottle he hadn't yet uncorked. I didn't forge anything, he said. Someone handed me a packet, the recipe, the email printout, some clippings from her columns. I assumed it was legit. Who gave it to you? I never got a name. It was delivered. To your office? He hesitated. To my apartment. I arched an eyebrow. Fancy that. Someone hand-delivers a mysterious culinary masterpiece. To your home and you don't ask who? He looked away. I was desperate. The launch was 2 weeks out and we had nothing that would get buzz. And then this shows up. Perfect timing, beautifully written, on brand for our culinary narrative. Crap. So you gambled. Everyone gambles. This one just looked like a sure thing. I asked for the envelope it came in. He didn't have it. Tossed it weeks ago, he said. It was plain. No return address. Sure, convenient, but not implausible. I left before he could invent anything else and called Lon Cohen from the Gazette. Need a background, I told him. Adrian Galt, look for debt, lawsuits, old employers, scandals with spice. Lon came through faster than expected. Galt had cooked at 2 now-defunct fusion restaurants, both of which folded after health inspections. One involved a rat, the other a flaming tempura accident that scorched a critic's blazer. No lawsuits on him personally, but he'd hopped jobs more often than a hot potato at a line cook convention. Next on the list, Vernon Trace, the editor. If Galt was the opportunist, Trace was the amplifier. And in this racket, the amplifier is rarely innocent. I dropped in unannounced again and found him at a cafe, sipping something that looked like tea but smelled like trend chasing. "Archie," he beamed. "Looking for quotes?" "Looking for answers," he laughed. "Aren't we all?" "Let's talk honesty. You ran a review full of quotes that weren't verified. You published it under the assumption Daria Helms had contributed. And she didn't?" "She says she didn't." "Galt says he got a mystery packet." "And the email you received? From a ghost." "No such address in her records." So the question becomes, who handed Galt that packet, and who gave you the green light? Smiled too quickly. "I just published what was sent." "You sure it wasn't you who created the packet?" That wiped the smile. "You think I'd do all this for a soup?" I leaned in. "I think someone's making a name off this mess. And when the dust clears, someone's going to be sued. If you're smart, you'll help us find who started it before the blame lands on you." He sighed and pulled out his phone. "Okay, look, I didn't create the material, but someone from our intern pool was acting weird about the story. Girl named Callie. She's a culinary student, does weekend shifts, always asking about narrative. Arcs in reviews. Smart, but twitchy. Give me a last name. Bellamy. Callie Bellamy. I didn't waste time. Called Saul Panzer, the closest thing we've got to a bloodhound, in a trench coat. Callie Bellamy, I told him. Intern at Epitable, culinary student, potential middleman. Within 4 hours, Saul had a file. Callie was 23, attending Parsons Culinary Institute, had a blog where she reviewed restaurants under an alias, Salted Whimsy, and had posted an entry 2 months ago titled The Theft of Taste. It was an angry piece, vague and venomous, about critics ruining the culinary world by stealing ideas, never cooking, always judging. I read it twice. It had Daria Helms written all over it. Metaphorically speaking, she hated Daria, or envied her, or both. Her blog was full of references to Tobias Crane's dishes. She'd attended his pop-up. She admired his smoke-forward minimalism. In one post, she described a grey broth so delicate it whispered of firewood and regret. Sound familiar? I paid a visit to Parsons the next day and cornered Callie outside the library. She was small, nervous, had lavender nail polish on one hand and a truffle slicer sticking out of her bag. "Callie Bellamy?" I asked. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" "Depends. You hand-deliver any recipes?" "Lately?" She froze. What?" "Soup. Ash. The kind that ruins reputations. I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. You sent the packet." Galt never asked questions because it looked real. Vernon ran it because it came from him. "And what did you get? Revenge, exposure, street cred?" Her eyes darted. "I was just trying to prove a point." I waited. "She ruins people," Callie whispered. "Critics like her, they destroy creativity." Crane was brilliant. She mocked him, tore down his work. So I took his idea, her words, combined them. Gave it to Galt, let them all choke on it. "You forged her email, well, she deserved it." And Crane, I told him nothing. He had nothing to do with it. But he was the spark. I called Wolfe the moment I left the building. Gave him everything. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Bring her." "You want to question her?" "No, I want to observe her." Back at the brownstone, I walked her into the office. Wolfe didn't greet her. He studied her as Fritz brought in beer and pretended not to eavesdrop. Callie sat stiffly, eyes wide. "I understand your frustration," Wolfe finally said. "But what you did is not a critique. It is not art. It is fabrication. And you did not elevate either Crane or yourself. You merely muddied the broth." Callie blinked. I didn't mean, you did. You meant to hurt. And you succeeded. Miss, Helms has suffered unjustly. The restaurant may collapse. And your chef idol will discover his ideas have been weaponized. I just wanted people to taste something real. Then you should have cooked, Wolfe said coldly. Instead, you lied. I led her out while Wolfe poured his beer and muttered something about the sanctity of the palate. Back in the kitchen, Daria waited. Was it her? She asked. It was, I said. She baked a revenge soufflé and served it to the whole city. The next morning began like most do at the brownstone, quiet, orderly, and steeped in the scent of butter warming under Fritz's care. Wolfe was locked in his orchid room, as usual, and I was at my desk rereading my notes on the Callie Bellamy confession. Daria had gone home late the night before, shaken but vindicated, or so she thought. I was halfway through my second coffee when Fritz emerged from the kitchen wearing a frown that did not suit a man who could sear duck to perfection. Something is wrong, he said. When Fritz says those words, they don't come lightly. The man's devotion to culinary sanctity is only rivaled by Wolfe's devotion to routine. What's wrong? I asked. The spice rack. It's been moved. I blinked. Moved? Yes. Specifically the middle row. Someone handled the jars. One of the caps is misaligned by exactly 30 degrees, and the coriander jar was slightly out of place. Maybe you bumped it? He shot me a look usually reserved for sous chefs who burned shallots. I do not bump. Fair. Fritz doesn't bump, slouch, or fumble. If he says something is off, it's off. I went to the kitchen and examined the rack myself. To the untrained eye, everything looked pristine. But I've worked with Wolfe long enough to spot when something's been minutely disturbed. The coriander jar was 1/2 centimetre off its mark. The lid bore a faint smudge. Not Fritz's. He cooks like a surgeon and cleans like a monk. I dusted the cap with a tissue and found a small trace of oil, possibly olive, possibly not Fritz's, possibly not even from the kitchen. What's missing? I asked. Nothing, Fritz said, but I won't be sure until I do a full inventory. That meant an hour of weighing, sniffing, and labeling every jar from anise to za'atar. I left Fritz to it and headed up to the office, where Wolfe had emerged from his orchid sanctuary with a scowl that told me the scent of disorder had reached even him. I told him about the spice rack. His expression didn't change, but he reached for the bell on his desk and rang for Fritz, who entered carrying a clipboard like a war report. Confirmed, Fritz said. No spices are missing, but the coriander jar has a trace of residue that did not originate in my kitchen. Wolfe grunted. Coriander is not essential, but it is specific. Why touch it and leave it? Message? I offered. Sabotage? No, Wolfe said. Not sabotage. Someone was searching for something. In the spice jars or hiding something in them? We both looked at the tiny glass containers now lined in regimental perfection. That would be a foolish choice, Wolfe said. But so is creating a fictional recipe and mailing it to an unstable chef. We were being watched. Not the building. Us. Someone had been inside the brownstone. Someone who wanted access to the kitchen, but not to poison. To investigate. I checked the locks. No sign of forced entry. Wolfe checked his safe. Untouched. Nothing else appeared disturbed, except the coriander jar. That night I set a trap. I didn't tell Wolfe the full details. He would have objected to the mess. But I left a faint dusting of flour on the kitchen threshold, placed a chair near the back door with a matchstick wedged between the frame and the wall, and attached a small slip of paper under the spice rack that would fall if the roux was moved. Again. Then I waited. Nothing happened. Until the third night. It was 3:14 a.m. I heard the softest creak from the floorboard near the back door. Not loud, not clumsy. Careful, I waited. 10 seconds later, a hand reached into the kitchen, gloved, steady, and moved toward the spice rack. I flicked on the light and stepped into view with my .38 drawn, more for effect than use. The intruder froze. Young, lean, dressed in black with a kitchen courier's satchel slung over one shoulder. "Don't move," I said. He didn't. He dropped the satchel and raised his hands. "Who are you?" I asked. He licked his lips. Wes Ryland. I'm a food courier." "Not at 3 a.m. You're not. I wasn't stealing." I was looking for the sample. "What sample?" "The soup. The original ash soup." "Someone said Wolfe had it." I thought maybe it was hidden. He looked more pathetic than threatening. I frisked him, found nothing but a phone and a pen. Then I opened the satchel. Inside, camera, notebook, 2 printed recipes, including the forged Daria one, and a small container labeled Cendre V2 Unofficial. "Well," I said, "you've been busy." I marched him into the office where Wolfe was, of course, already awake and seated, eyes narrowed like a judge with insomnia. "This," I said, shoving Wes into the chair, "was trying to locate the soup." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "I'm a culinary blogger," Wes mumbled. "I run a channel, Midnight Kitchen. I was going to do a video and the forbidden soup, get views. I heard Wolfe had the original. Someone on a forum said you kept it in the spice rack. Said it wasn't just metaphor, it was physical." "A forum," Wolfe said flatly. "Yes, private chefs, food theorists. There's a thread. A guy named Vantablack43 said you were keeping the recipe out of public reach." "I'm not," Wolfe said. "I'm keeping it out of my digestive system." Wes looked miserable. "I didn't mean harm. I just wanted proof. Something original, a scoop." "You broke into a private residence. You trespassed. You interfered." "With an investigation. I'm sorry." "Of that," Wolfe said, "I have no doubt. Archie, escort him out. Do not involve the police. I will decide his penance." I walked Wes to the sidewalk. He promised to delete his footage. I told him if he didn't, the next person knocking would be wearing a badge. He disappeared into the night like a thief in search of fame instead of fortune. Back inside, I found Wolfe standing beside the kitchen doorway. An unusual move. He wasn't admiring the spice rack. He was thinking. "We are being observed," he muttered. "This is no longer about Daria Helms alone. The false dish has inspired obsession, not for flavor, for power. What do we do?" "We finish it. Call Saul. Tell him to find Vantablack43. And then?" "And then," Wolfe said, "we pull the last thread before the whole thing unravels across my kitchen floor. Saul Panzer doesn't waste time." You give him a name, a screen handle, or a partial license plate number, and he gives you back a file thick enough to serve as insulation. So when I handed him the pseudonym Vantablack43, I expected results. I didn't expect them within 6 hours, and with a level of certainty that would make the NSA jealous. His report landed on Wolfe's desk before breakfast. "Real name's Jeremy Cull," Saul said. 35, failed culinary student, former sous chef, bounced between kitchens, fired 3 times, tried starting a YouTube channel reviewing underground cuisine, which is a fancy way of saying things no one wants to eat. "Ambitious," I said. "Delusional," Saul replied. "He's obsessed with food conspiracies, thinks big-name critics manipulate trends, that chefs like Tobias Crane are martyrs, calls Daria Helms a gatekeeper, the usual angry foodie." "Nonsense," Wolfe grunted. "Where is he now?" "Works as night staff at a test kitchen in Chelsea, lives in a basement apartment in Queens. I've already sent someone to watch him." discreetly, always. Wolfe dismissed Saul and turned his eyes to me. Go. Speak to this Mr. Cull. Do not alert him. Do not threaten. I want to know how deeply he's cooked himself into this. I headed out, pausing just long enough to grab my coat and a pocket-sized notebook that had seen more confessions than a priest during wartime. The test kitchen was a sleek, borrowed space full of chrome surfaces and awkward interns. I found Jeremy Cull near the back, rinsing plastic bins and muttering under his breath. "Jeremy," I said casually. He jumped like I'd slapped a cloche down on his soul. "Who are you?" "Friend of a friend," I said. "I'm a food content guy. Heard you might know something about a certain soup. Ash-based, controversial." His eyes narrowed. "Who sent you?" "Curiosity," I said. "You've posted theories, gotten close, just wondering how close." He wiped his hands and gestured toward a small break room. Once we were inside, he dropped the pretense. "It's real, you know. The soup, the theft, the cover-up, they're all in on it. They, Helms, the restaurants, the critics, they protect their own. No room for outsiders. Tobias Crane, he was the future. Daria buried him with one article. You think, she stole his recipe? I know she did. I've read her columns. She drops hints, buries phrases. She lifts from people who can't fight back. Did you send Galt the fake packet?" His eyes twitched. "I didn't fake anything." "But you knew about it." "I encouraged it. On a forum. I posted instructions." "If someone did it, that's their initiative. I didn't forge the email." "But you celebrated it." "I exposed the lie, even if the lie was yours." He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward. "You know what this dish is? It's not just soup, it's symbolic. It's the ashes of the old world. And someone tried to serve it with a garnish of stolen glory." "Deep," I said dryly. "Any idea who actually sent the packet?" He tilted his head. "Callie, maybe. She was vocal. Hated Helms even more than I did. But the real mind? That's harder to say." I let that sit. Then asked, "You ever visit the brownstone?" He gave a nervous laugh. "I'd be shot at the gate." "Someone's been inside." His face twisted into a grin. "Then maybe someone's playing you too." I left him there, polishing his fantasy like a tarnished trophy. He was angry, no doubt. But whether he was dangerous, that was still open. He hadn't started the fire, but he might be feeding it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had settled into the high-back chair like it owed him rent. "Cull is a true believer," I said. "He didn't send the packet, but he inspired someone who did." "Callie," Wolfe said. "She had motive, access, a poetic flair." "But," Wolfe said, "she is not alone. There is one more ingredient in this pot." He turned to the files again. "What of Crane?" "He's laying low. Swears he never created the ash soup to begin with. Claims it was stolen from him. But we now have 3 parties pointing fingers and 1 chef still profiting." "Galt," Wolfe said. "Exactly. That night we received a call from Daria. She sounded panicked. Her voice shook. Someone broke into my apartment. I was there in 20 minutes. The place was small but orderly until tonight. Books scattered, a lamp knocked over. Her laptop was gone. So were the recipe clippings from her files. "Nothing else touched," she said. "Not my wallet, not jewelry, just the work. No witnesses?" I was out, came home and found the door barely latched. We called it in but didn't wait for the uniforms. I called Wolfe. "Confirmed," I said. "They're trying to erase something or plant something." Wolfe was silent for a moment. Then, "Come home. Bring Miss Helms. I will summon the circle." The office gathering? Indeed, when we returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was already in his chair, the chairs arranged in a semicircle, the beer poured, and the stage, such as it is, set. Daria sat beside me, arms folded, watching the door like it owed her an explanation. At precisely 8 o'clock they arrived. Galt, Crane, Vernon, Callie, and Saul standing behind them like an usher at a very awkward wedding. No one spoke. Wolfe waited for the silence to ferment. "I have convened you," he said, "because a lie was cooked, served, and consumed by the public. It has harmed careers, endangered reputations, and now trespassed into my house." He turned his eyes to Galt. "You, Mr. Galt, claim to have received a recipe. You verified nothing. You profited. I didn't know. Spare us." He turned to Vernon. "You ran a piece based on fraudulent approval. To be fair, you were not. That is the point." Then to Callie. "You created the deception, but not alone." She flinched. "There was another," Wolfe said, "who ensured the story spread, who forged the email." He gestured. "Mr. Crane?" Everyone turned. Crane stood, eyes wide. "That's ridiculous. You said the soup was stolen from you, that Daria attended your pop-up, but she was never on the guest list. We confirmed you lied. She was there." "No, but Callie was." He stood stunned. "She admired your work, worshipped it. You convinced her you were wronged. She acted. But the email, the packet, the handwriting, that was yours. We have a match from the pop-up sign-in book." Crane's hands curled into fists. "She destroyed me." "No," Wolfe said, voice low. "You destroyed yourself. You framed her. You manipulated a student. And you let others carry the weight." Crane lunged, then stopped. The room held its breath. "You can't prove—" "I can," Wolfe said. "And I will." And just like that, the pressure broke. Crane sat, quiet, finished. Wolfe looked at me. "Call Inspector Kramer." And dinner was served. Inspector Kramer arrived the next morning with a cigar clenched so tight between his teeth that I half expected it to crack in two. He stormed into the office like it owed him bail money and took his usual seat without waiting to be offered one. Wolfe, of course, remained seated in his massive chair, fingers steepled, mouth set in a line that said he was about to enjoy himself. "Start talking," Kramer snapped. "You said this wasn't a murder. If it's not murder—" "What the hell am I doing here?" Wolfe's voice came low and steady. "You are here because a man's ego attempted character assassination through culinary deception, and in doing so he orchestrated multiple criminal acts, breaking and entering, identity forgery, defamation, and conspiracy. It may not be murder, but it reeks. I was standing off to the side, hands in my pockets, watching the whole thing simmer. Daria Helms sat quietly in the corner, arms wrapped around herself like she was still trying to brace for one more blow. Crane, Wolfe said, manipulated a student to carry out his plan. He forged an email address in Miss Helms's name. He compiled a packet that made it appear she authored a fictitious recipe and arranged for it to land in the hands of a desperate chef. From there, a chain of assumption did the rest. He's denied everything, I added. But the handwriting from the forged packet matches a menu note signed during his old pop-up, one we pulled from the guest book. Saul had it confirmed by a forensic analyst. Circumstantial, Kramer grunted. Perhaps, but combined with motive, timing, and confessions from the accomplice, more than enough for a warrant. And this accomplice, Callie Bellamy, already confessed. We've got it recorded. She was emotionally manipulated by Crane and acted out of loyalty. Foolish loyalty, but not malicious. She admitted to compiling clippings and adding color, but Crane provided the bones. Kramer growled, leaned forward, and pointed his cigar at Wolfe. And you're telling me this all started over a soup? No, Wolfe said. It started over ambition. The soup was merely the flavor of the crime. He let that hang in the air, and Kramer finally sat back, exhaling hard through his nose. You said there was trespassing in your kitchen. Indeed. A misguided blogger entered my home searching for a fabricated myth. He was not Crane's. Porn, merely a consequence of the gossip Crane seeded. The man has agreed to leave the matter alone and disappear from the culinary forums. For now, Kramer nodded. I'll bring in Crane, but I'll need all the files. They're on the desk, Wolfe replied. And Mr. Goodwin will provide supplemental context if you require translation into the vernacular. Kramer smirked at that and took the envelope without another word. When he left, the room went still again, the air decompressing like a kettle, finally off the flame. Wolfe turned to Daria. You are exonerated. The soup, the forged packet, the association with the recipe, they were part of a deliberate act of professional sabotage. Mr. Crane's desire for revenge was stronger than his ethics. Daria nodded slowly, but her face didn't show relief, just weariness. But the reviews, the articles, the headlines, they won't vanish. No, Wolfe admitted, but nor will the truth. Mr. Cohen at the Gazette has been informed. Your rebuttal will be printed. The facts will follow. And the damage will fade. A scandal has a short memory, especially when corrected. She stood, glanced at the door, then paused. Thank you. Wolfe inclined his head once, which, in his language, was a standing ovation. After she left, Wolfe closed his eyes and sighed. The brownstone has been uncomfortably exposed. I dislike that. I noticed, I said, but you handled it. He opened one eye. No more spice rack invasions. I'll reinforce the back door. Good. That afternoon, I went to Tamarind and Iron. Galt was still there, barely holding it together. His name had been splashed across every local food site within hours of the confrontation, and while he wasn't guilty of fraud, he was guilty of laziness, cowardice, and the kind of desperation that makes people look elsewhere when they should be checking the signature. On a recipe. I didn't know, he told me for the 5th time. You didn't ask, I said. That's your sin. They're calling it Scandra's soup now, he muttered. Velouté de cendre, my masterpiece. Ruined. Wasn't yours to begin with. Still hurts. I left him there, muttering about bitterness and burned onions, and returned home. Fritz had prepared a restorative lunch, veal with cream sauce and wild mushrooms, a polite reminder that the only real cooking worth discussing still happened under this roof. Wolfe ate in silence, as he always does when the weight of idiocy has settled into his bones. But as the plates were cleared, he said something uncharacteristic. This was an attack. I raised an eyebrow. On your palate? On the principles of order, he said. Fabrication, ego, careless amplification, all for notoriety. No one respected the process, the dish, the author, the origin. They trampled meaning for flavor, spoken like a philosopher of broth. He almost smiled. I dislike flavor without honesty. And what do you call our role in this mess? He poured himself a glass of beer. Necessary seasoning. That night, the brownstone returned to its proper state. Quiet, measured, and sealed tight. I locked every door twice and triple-checked the spice rack, which Fritz had reorganized alphabetically to erase the memory. Upstairs, Wolfe was reading. Below, the world buzzed with headlines about fake recipes and exposed egos. But in our little fortress of orchids and butter, the truth had been restored, and the soup that didn't exist no longer cast a shadow on anyone's name. The next morning, started with the quiet confidence of closure. Kramer had taken Crane into custody just before midnight. The charges were fluid, still being drafted, but they'd certainly stick. Fraudulent impersonation, attempted defamation, and criminal conspiracy for starters. Callie Bellamy had given a full written statement. She wouldn't be charged, not formally. She'd be disciplined by her institute, no doubt, and barred from any reputable editorial position for the foreseeable future. Galt's restaurant had shut down temporarily for menu revision. Permanent would have been more honest. Still, Wolfe wasn't satisfied. Justice may have been served, but the presentation, in his view, still lacked refinement. At 11 a.m. sharp, he summoned the remaining pieces of the affair back into the brownstone for what he called a final accounting. Wolfe believed in concluding things thoroughly. Loose ends annoyed him almost as much as improperly cooked fish. So when our familiar suspects, Daria Helms, Adrian Galt, Vernon Trace, and Callie Bellamy, filed once more into the office, they found Wolfe waiting in his chair with his customary glass of beer and a table stacked with folders. Saul Panzer stood near the door. Fritz, by unspoken agreement, had cleared the kitchen. And me, I stood leaning against the bookshelf, watching the pressure build one last time. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. This is not a trial, he said. It is not an inquisition. You are here because you played parts, willing or otherwise, in a farce that disrupted reputations, corrupted trust, and trespassed upon this house. He paused, letting the room settle. Miss Helms, he said, nodding toward Daria, you were targeted. You maintained your position under immense pressure. You are owed not only vindication, but recognition. Daria nodded politely, her voice soft but firm. Thank you. I never imagined a recipe could nearly end my career. That is because, Wolfe said, you understand food as truth. Your attackers did not. He turned his attention to Galt. Mr. Galt, you received a document from an anonymous source. You accepted it as authentic. You based your restaurant's launch upon it and allowed a fabricated myth to grow unchecked. I was under pressure, Galt muttered. I made a bad call. You made a lazy one, Wolfe corrected. You sought prestige through shortcuts and neglected scrutiny. You may not have authored the deceit, but you benefited from it until the consequences outpaced the applause. Vernon Trace fidgeted in his seat. But Wolfe wasn't done, Mr. Trace. You published the myth. You claim you confirmed your quotes through a falsified email, yet you accepted it with no verification beyond formatting. You failed in your duty as a gatekeeper of fact. Vernon bristled. We were rushed. We had a deadline. It came from a source we trusted. Trust, Wolfe said coolly, is no substitute for rigor. Then his eyes fell on Callie Bellamy. You, he said simply. She looked down. You were manipulated. That is true, but you were not blind. You orchestrated the delivery of the fraudulent recipe. You did so with malice, even if you believed it was righteous. You weaponized admiration into sabotage. I know, she whispered. I wasn't trying to ruin her. I thought I was correcting something. Correction is not destruction, Wolfe replied. You chose to become an architect of chaos because it suited your narrative, Callie. Didn't respond. She couldn't. Wolfe lifted a folder. This case was never about a dish, he continued. It was about ownership, of ideas, of legacy, of voice. Mr. Crane sought vengeance. You all, in some way, became vectors for that ambition. But let it be known, reputation, like cuisine, is delicate. Once scorched, it takes time to restore. He passed the folder to me. Inside were copies of every forged document, analysis reports, witness statements, meticulously catalogued. Wolfe had no plans to use them further, but he wanted everyone to know the record was complete. Then Wolfe gestured toward the side table, where Fritz had, at Wolfe's order, prepared a very specific dish. Velouté de cendre, I announced, uncovering the plate. Galt paled. No tricks, Wolfe said. It has been cooked precisely as described in the original fraudulent recipe, the one submitted anonymously to Mr. Galt. Fritz had cooked it exactly once, under Wolfe's supervision, and with great reluctance. Wolfe hadn't tasted it then. He wanted it served now. To understand a lie, he said, one must confront it. He gestured. Taste it. No one moved. Daria stepped forward. She took a spoon, dipped it into the greyish liquid, and tasted. She made a face. It's flat, she said. Overbuilt, trying too hard, like it wants to impress you instead of feed you. Wolfe nodded. Exactly. A dish without a soul. It mimics sophistication, but lacks origin. Galt tasted next, then Callie, then Vernon, each with their own wince, frown, or shrug. The dish wasn't bad, it wasn't poisoned, but it was hollow, pretension in liquid form. A symbol, Wolfe said, of what ambition becomes without integrity. He leaned back, satisfied. You are free to leave. There will be no further pursuit from me. But I suggest you remember the cost of imitation without honor. And just like that, the meeting was over. They filed out slowly. Daria lingered for a moment. I still don't understand, she said. Why me? Why not someone bigger, more influential? Because, Wolfe said, you write with precision. Those who resent discipline often attack it. She gave him a half smile. You're not so different from me, are you? No, Wolfe said. But I am better fed. After she left, Wolfe turned to me. Mr. Goodwin, would you kindly dispose of that revolting broth? With pleasure. As I carried the dish out and dumped it into the sink, I couldn't help but smile. The dish that didn't exist had finally been tasted, judged, and discarded. Just like the lies that built it, and with that the brownstone was clean again. 2 days passed with blessed silence. Wolfe returned to his books. Fritz resumed his experiments with foie gras variations. Even the orchids seemed less tense, but I knew better. Wolfe wasn't finished. Not until every morsel of this case had been chewed, swallowed, and digested. On the third morning, I found him in the office, leaning slightly forward in his chair, not reading, not dictating, thinking. That's Wolfe's version of pacing. Only without the steps. You're bothered, I said, dropping into the red chair opposite him. I am unfulfilled, he replied. Crane's in custody. Callie's confession is signed. Daria's reputation is patched. Galt's restaurant is circling the drain. What's left? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Something about the sequence still fails to settle, I frowned. Sequence? Yes. The timeline. The forged email arrived 3 days before Galt's launch. Callie admitted to assembling the packet, but not to sending it. Crane denied authoring it, despite handwriting evidence. Cull claims no part. We believe Crane manipulated Callie, who delivered the material. But something's missing. I rubbed my jaw. You think someone else sent it? No, I think someone else enabled it. He rose, a rare, deliberate movement, and walked to the bookshelf. Recall the intrusion. Here, he said. The spice rack. The false rumor that we possessed the original recipe. I remember. That rumor did not originate with Crane, nor with Callie, nor Cull. He pulled a file from the shelf. Vernon Tracy's interview transcript. Consider. Mr. Tracy's involvement, Wolfe said. Editor, influencer, gatekeeper. He published the review. He claims he believed the email was genuine because it came from Galt's press packet. Exactly. But who printed the packet? I blinked. Galt says it arrived at his apartment, but it wasn't an email, it was a hard copy, meaning someone physically delivered it. Callie, Wolfe said, insisted she gave it to someone else to drop off, but she never named that person. I sat up straighter. You think Trace did it? I think he had more than editorial interest. I called Saul. Trace, he said. I looked at him once already. Want a deeper dig? Deeper, I said. Financials, connections, who his publication sponsors are, who he dines with, who benefits if Helms takes a dive. 2 hours. Later, Saul sent over a report. I read it twice. Trace had recently begun consulting privately for a group investing in boutique restaurants, one of which was Tamarind and Iron. He'd met with Galt's financial backers twice in the month leading to the launch. Emails showed he suggested finding a narrative to set the menu apart. When Galt panicked about not having a signature dish, Trace suggested reaching out to literary voices in food. Around that same time, Callie delivered her packet. Through an unnamed middleman, I relayed all this to Wolfe. Deliberate orchestration, he murmured. Trace saw an opportunity. He knew Galt needed a hook. He encouraged Callie to act, perhaps not directly, but enough. So what? He nudged the crime into place, then cashed in on the story. Yes, Wolfe said, and ensured his magazine received first dibs on the myth. Is it provable? Circumstantially. Unless he confesses, he will skate on legality, but his influence is now neutralized. Wolfe called Lon Cohen. You may quote me, he said calmly, that Vernon Trace is no longer welcome in this house, nor should he be welcome in any publication concerned with factual integrity. His name will never again appear in my kitchen. Lon, who hated being scooped, promised to run something sharp. And just like that, the last ingredient of the affair was identified. Not the chef, not the critic, not the admirer, but the one who stirred the pot from the shadows. That night I poured Wolfe his beer. To closure, I said. He sniffed. To clarity. As we sat in companionable quiet, Wolfe finally spoke again. Mr. Goodwin. Yes? This matter confirms something I have long believed. Recipes may belong to no one, but the truth behind them does. We must treat it as sacred. I raised my glass. And when someone tries to fake a sacred dish? He looked at me with the faintest flicker of humor. We serve them their own seasoning. The brownstone was calm again. No more visitors, no interviews, no anonymous notes slid under the door. Wolfe's world, orchids, mealtimes, silence, had returned to its default settings. Even the orchids seemed less agitated. Fritz resumed preparing meals that didn't require suspicion or forensic examination. As for me, I finally had time to finish a report that had been sitting on my desk since the day this soup circus started. But even in calm, Wolfe brooded. Not visibly, he wasn't the pacing type, but internally, with small signs. His eyes lingered longer on files he'd already closed. His comments at lunch became shorter, heavier. The man had caught the perpetrator. Unmasked every party, restored Daria's name. But something in him hadn't cooled. It wasn't just the crime, it was the principle that had been simmered, strained, and discarded. Wolfe might tolerate a world full of liars and thieves, but culinary fraud, intellectual theft dressed up as art, gnawed at something deeper. On the fourth day, I found him in the office, rereading Daria Helms's original columns, the ones that had been copied, cut, and sewn into the Frankenstein dish. "These are thoughtful," he muttered. "Not bad, huh?" I said. "She understands ingredients, respects lineage, gives context without suffocation." "You planning to send fan mail?" No, I plan to offer her a seat at dinner. I blinked. Wolfe, inviting someone not tied to an active case to dinner was as rare as Fritz serving ketchup. You're serious? She was wronged. She held herself with dignity, and she writes well. Those are credentials worth honoring. I made the call. Daria accepted without hesitation. That evening, Wolfe had Fritz prepare a 4-course meal inspired by her earliest published piece, a piece that had been plagiarized, mocked, and now redeemed. Velouté was nowhere in sight. She arrived in a charcoal dress, modest but sharp, and carried a folder under her arm. Wolfe stood to greet her. That alone made the air change temperature. "Miss Helms," he said, "you are most welcome." She smiled, not shyly, but respectfully. "Thank you. I hope the folder doesn't offend. I brought the article drafts, the real ones." He took them without comment and placed them on his desk. We ate. And for once, Wolfe didn't dominate the conversation. He asked questions about ingredients, phrasing, editorial politics. She answered without showmanship. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation between two people who knew the cost of getting things right. Over dessert, pear tart with spiced creme, she leaned back. "I still get messages," she said. "Anonymous ones, mostly online. Some accuse me of playing victim. Others call the soup mine like a joke. Public retraction rarely satisfies the public," Wolfe said. "They prefer spectacle." "I'd just like to forget it happened." "You won't," he said. "Nor should you, but you will outlive it, and what remains will be your precision." She nodded. "Then, what about Crane?" "He will plead. The evidence is too strong. He will never work again, at least not publicly." "And Trace?" "Removed," Wolfe said. Quietly, but permanently. After she left, Wolfe returned to the folder she had brought. He read through each column again, carefully. Not for evidence, for appreciation. I stood behind him with a beer and cleared my throat. "So," I said. "That's it?" "Yes." "No." "Lingering irritation?" "Some," he admitted. "But it is not aimed at Crane, or Callie, or even Trace." "Then who?" He looked up at Galt. "For allowing mediocrity to masquerade as innovation. For allowing fear to override judgment. For letting desperation become taste." That's harsh. It's correct. Later that night, I sat in the kitchen with Fritz while he cleaned the last of the pans. We talked about nothing for a while. Then I asked him what he thought of the whole affair. He paused, drying his hands. "There is a reason we use precise measurements," he said. "Because every time you guess, you lose something. Flavor, texture, integrity. The same is true with people." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I grasped it. But I understood enough. Wolfe had closed the case. The soup was off the menu. The truth had been plated, tasted, and served. And maybe, just maybe, this time it would stay down. It ended, as it often does at the brownstone, with silence and clarity. The newspaper column ran on a Sunday, front page of the food section, signed by Daria Helms. No drama, no outrage, just a direct, well-written account of the truth. The soup never existed. The email was forged. Reputations were used as currency, and behind it all stood ambition dressed as innovation. She named no names, but readers understood. Crane's career, once fringe and provocative, was done. Vernon Trace resigned from Epitable, citing creative differences. The magazine didn't argue. Adrian Galt's restaurant never reopened. His investors disappeared faster than his. Reservations had when the reviews turned sour. And Callie Bellamy? She dropped out of Parsons and vanished from the forums, her digital footprints swept away like flour off a marble counter. Wolfe didn't gloat. He never does. He consumed the fallout with the same detachment he shows to overcooked lamb, regretful but not sentimental. Still, something lingered, something unresolved even after justice had been served. It was a Thursday morning, and I was sitting in the office going through bills when Wolfe cleared his throat. Mr. Goodwin? That tone meant he had thoughts he didn't want to keep to himself. Yeah? He folded his hands across his chest. You understand, of course, that the final reveal of this case was not the forger, nor the intruder, nor even the orchestrator. Then what was it? He paused. It was the motive that refused to declare itself. Crane's revenge was obvious, Callie's admiration, Trace's profiteering, but beneath all of it was the same thing. I waited. Hunger. I raised an eyebrow. The man who hates metaphor is using hunger as one. He didn't flinch. Not metaphor, fact. Crane hungered for validation. Trace hungered for relevance. Callie for recognition. Even Galt for survival. They cooked a dish together, one none of them could stomach, but it fed their desires for a moment. And Daria? She hungered for integrity, and she kept it. I let that sink in for a second. Wolfe leaned back and reached for his beer. You were bothered in the middle of it, I said. More than usual, even after you solved it. Yes, he admitted. Because the crime was not clever. It was clumsy, and yet it worked. For a time. That offends me more than brilliance used for evil. So what now? We returned to order. Fritz brought in lunch, duck breast with blackberry glaze and wild rice. Wolfe ate quietly, chewing each bite as if reclaiming something stolen. Afterwards, he wiped his mouth and said, You may file the report. Title it as you like. I sat back at my desk, opened the typewriter, and considered the words, Nero Wolfe, and the dish that didn't exist. A Nero Wolfe story. A tale of flavors forged, reputations simmered, and truth served cold. By evening, the brownstone was still again. The spice rack was immaculate, the doors were locked, and Wolfe was back in the plant room, tending to orchids that never lied. We'd chased a ghost recipe through jealousy, fraud, ambition, and fear. And when we found it, it turned out to be empty. No taste, no truth, just ashes. And Wolfe, immovable as always, had ensured those ashes didn't touch his table.